In this lesson, you will learn 5 steps to make sure you always know exactly what you should be doing from the moment you start until the moment you finish your academic Task 1 answer. Then we will look at 5 sample answers for different question types so that you know how to apply these 5 steps practically. Step 1 is to analyze the question. Step 2 is to paraphrase the question. Step 3 is to write the overview. Step 4 is to write the details paragraphs. And step 5 is to proofread your answer. My name is Lara Ryan. I've been an IELTS examiner. I used to teach IELTS at the British Council, and I've been helping students to achieve their dream scores for over a decade. As I already mentioned, step 1 is to analyze the question. And this is quite similar to the previous lesson where we wrote on the question, we added arrows and different symbols to help us organize all the categories. The difference this time is that we're not just marking things for our overview, we're going to make a note of anything that's significant in the graph. So this could be something like a similarity between 2 categories, or it could be one category that stands out from the rest for some reason or another. In this lesson, we'll look at many examples of this in the sample answers. Step 2 is to paraphrase the question, and this just means you're going to rewrite the question statement in your own words. Now, when paraphrasing the question, the biggest mistake you can make is writing a sentence that does not have the exact same meaning as the original question statement. Besides that, the most common mistakes that IELTS candidates make is that they spend way too long trying to write the paraphrase because they're afraid to use any of the words from the question. Now, what you have to remember is that the paraphrase is actually the least important of all the sentences in your essay, so it does not deserve a lot of your limited time. And step 3 is to write the overview. Now, to be completely confident that you can write overviews accurately, you'll need to complete my overview lesson. However, I'll just summarize it for you here. Whenever the graph in the question has just 1 year, you organize the categories according to the highest and lowest figures. But when there is more than 1 year, you organize the categories according to the increases and the decreases. Besides that, just make sure that you don't include any specific information about any of the categories. So one small thing that happened to a category, or perhaps a piece of data like a percentage, does not belong in the overview. And in our answer, we put the paraphrase and the overview together in the first paragraph. Step 4 is to write the details paragraphs. So what I just said about the overview, that you don't put any specific information, this is where you put that information. And the details paragraphs will be paragraph 2 and 3 of your answer. We just write about each category one at a time with all the necessary details and make it as clear as possible so that the reader can imagine what the chart looks like. And the final step is to proofread your answer. That means you're just going to read your answer after you've finished writing it, find any vocabulary or grammar mistakes that you've made, and correct them. This is a vital step because it really helps to improve your overall band score by increasing your lexical resource and grammatical range and accuracy. But there are 2 main reasons why IELTS candidates tend to ignore this step. The first reason is that they think they haven't made any mistakes. And if that sounds like you, please just read your answer one time to see if that's actually true. And the second most common reason is because IELTS candidates don't have enough time. Now, my experience with IELTS students is that those who don't have enough time tend to write very long answers. Now, if you regularly write Task 1 answers that are over 200 words, you can improve your overall score by reducing the length and using that extra time to proofread your finished answer instead. So those are the 5 steps, and it's time to look at the first of the 5 sample answers in this lesson. This is a line graph, and as you can see, there is more than 1 year, so this will be organized according to increases and decreases. So if we look at the blue line, we can see that this one had an overall increase, so I'll draw an arrow pointing upwards next to this category, and then I'll do the same thing for the red line, which is washing machines. For the yellow line, which is telephones, this one actually finished at relatively the same level as it started. So I'll point this arrow to the right to help me remember that that's what happened. And then this last one has an arrow pointing upwards as well. So this is what we learned in the previous lesson about overviews, and now we're going to look for any other significant features that we can make a note of as well. What stands out to me first is that the blue line had the highest figures for each of the years shown, and that's definitely significant. So I'll mark that on the question with a H. And the same thing applies to the green line being the lowest, so I'll make a note of that as well. So looking at the red and yellow line, we can see that the yellow line started as the second highest but finished as the second lowest. So obviously describing these two would require much longer explanations, but even if it wasn't the case, being the second and third highest categories isn't significant enough to mention anyway. And that means I'm not going to make any marks for this on the question sheet. And that's essentially what we need to do to analyse the question, and it's time to write the answer. So firstly, we just have the paraphrase where we're going to repeat what the question says in our own words. The chart illustrates how many appliances were sold in an electronic shop in Ghana between 1965 and 2000. Here you can see that I've used 5 words that were in the question, and that's completely fine. I'm not aiming to have none of the words from the question, I'm just aiming to use as many of my own words as possible. So let's just look at the most basic version of the overview with the increases and decreases. Overall, there was an increase in the sales of all appliances except for telephones, which had relatively the same figure by the end of the period. If this overview was longer, I wouldn't add any extra information, but because this is a reasonable length, I'm going to add one of the other features that we noticed earlier. In each of the years, the number of refrigerators purchased was the highest. And that's what our first paragraph looks like with the paraphrase and overview completed. That means that we're ready to move on to our details paragraphs. Now, when organising the details paragraphs, we have to consider how to do this as logically as possible. So what I'm going to do is start with the highest category and move down to the second highest and continue through all 4. Now, because there are 4 categories in this question, I will put 2 of them in the first details paragraph and the other 2 in the second details paragraph. Starting with our description of refrigerators, refrigerator sales started with about 740 units in 1965, and despite slight dips leading up to 1975 and 1990, they increased throughout the period to finish at around 990. Next, we'll describe washing machines. Around 390 washing machines were purchased in 1965, and this rose to about 580 in 1975. From then, it fluctuated between roughly 590 and 520 until the final year, when it grew to approximately 660. So, as you can see, we don't just mention the data for the category in every year, we just select the most significant features and describe those. What is important though is that we start with the oldest year and move forwards in our description. That means we're on to our final paragraph and we're describing telephones next. Telephone sales started at around 400 before fluctuating between this figure and 300 until 1995, when a final increase brought it up to just over 400 in 2000. And the final category is televisions. Meanwhile, television purchases, which were the lowest of all the appliances each year, started at around 50, after which they increased to slightly over 200 in 1990 and remained at this level until the end. And that's the whole essay finished, but we still have step 5 to complete, where we proofread our finished answer. I typically make mistakes with Oxford commas, so when I first finished writing this answer, I read through it carefully and found about 3 or 4 that I needed to fix. Next, I found 3 spelling mistakes with the word throughout, where my fingers made the wrong motion when I was typing, so I had to correct those as well. And finally, I noticed that I had a limited range of vocabulary for estimates. I had used about 6 times, roughly 3 times, approximately 2 times, and I hadn't used the word around, so I edited my answer to improve the range. So as you can see, by proofreading my answer, I was able to improve my lexical resource and grammatical range and accuracy scores. Here is the full essay that we just looked at. I've left a line between each paragraph to make it very clear to the examiner where each paragraph starts and finishes. Now what we're looking at here are graphs and charts, and these are the most common types of questions you will get. However, you could potentially get a map question in Academic Task 1. And that's exactly what I will be showing you in my next lesson. So make sure you don't miss out on that by clicking like on my page or subscribe on my channel. Here's the second question, which has a table, and once more, there is more than one year, so for our overview, we're organising the categories according to which ones increased and which ones decreased. Between 2004 and 2020, we can see that the United States increased, China increased, Russia increased, France increased, the United Kingdom decreased, Japan increased, Germany increased, Italy decreased, and the total increased. Now, I'm just going to put 2 stars next to the decreases so that I can find them more quickly later. So just like when we were analysing the previous question, we're going to look for anything else significant in the chart that we can mention in the essay. We can look for the highest and lowest figures in each year. So here we have the United States as the highest in 2004 and the highest again in 2020. The fact that the United States has both of the highest figures is very convenient for us because it's much easier to describe that than when they belong to 2 different countries. Next we'll mark the lowest numbers, and in this case Italy had the lowest figures in both years. And one more significant thing that I notice is the size of China's increase, because it more than doubled, and I'm going to circle China to remind me about that. So that's step 1 out of the way. We're moving on to step 2 and step 3, where we write our paraphrase and overview. And here's the paraphrase. The chart shows details of the differences in the military spending of 8 countries between the years 2004 and 2020. And in the first part of the overview, I'm just looking at the increases and decreases. Overall, the total increased, as did the amount spent by all the countries except the United Kingdom and Italy. And now we'll add some of the other features. In both years, the United States budget was the highest and Italy's was the lowest. Now, this overview is long enough already, so we're not going to include that extra information we found about China. However, if we were going to include China in the overview, we would not be able to say that the figure more than doubled. That would just be too specific for an overview. Instead, we would have to describe this in a more general way and say something like China had the most significant increase. So now we have to describe all of the categories in our details paragraphs, and we have 8 countries and the total figure to describe. Now, we want to have roughly the same amount of information in each of the details paragraphs, so obviously we'll need to choose 5 categories for one of them and 4 categories for the other. Now, I want to describe the total figure first because it makes more sense to put that at the top with the other highest figures instead of at the end after the lowest figure. So that will be one category. Also remember that we need to do it in a logical order, so talking about the United States and China as the highest and second highest next makes sense, but remember we have extra details we want to describe about these 2 countries. So with all that in mind, I'm going to add 1 more country, and that will be 4 categories in the first details paragraph, and then we'll describe the rest of them in the second details paragraph. So with that in mind, here's the first details paragraph. The total money spent by all 8 countries increased from $930.2 billion in 2004 to $1,125.8 billion in 2020. The United States spending went from $623 billion to $778 billion, keeping it as the country with the highest amount spent. Of the 8 countries, China's spending had the most significant rise, as it went from $65 billion to $178 billion, whereas the Russian military budget had a more moderate increase from $50 billion to $61.7 billion. And onto our second details paragraph. Of the remaining countries, France's figure of $45 billion was the highest in 2004, and this rose to $48.3 billion. While the United Kingdom had a decrease of $1.3 billion, in Japan and Germany there was a growth of $10.7 billion and $16.4 billion respectively. Meanwhile, Italy continued to have the lowest figure as its budget went from $28.2 billion down to $15 billion. For the United Kingdom, Japan and Germany, I just included the size of their increases and decreases rather than both figures for each of these countries, because I'm trying to save time. This is usually necessary when there are a lot of data points like in this question. And this is the full essay that we just looked at. Now, what I'm showing you in this lesson is very important because the first stage of improving your IELTS scores is learning what to do. And the second stage is to find out what mistakes you're making in your own writing. And if you would like to join me for my free live feedback lessons, I will be able to tell you exactly what that is for you. You'll find the link to join me for those free lessons in the video description. The next question we're going to look at is usually very confusing for IELTS candidates. Now, the problem is not actually related to English ability, the problem is related to understanding the information as it's presented in the graph. So here's the question, and let me describe the most common issue. Here we see the blue category, Colgate, has decreased by about 5%, and this red one, Sensodyne, has increased by about 1%. Now, where a lot of candidates go wrong is they describe this as Sensodyne having a higher revenue than Colgate, but we can't say that because that's not the information that the graph is showing us. What the graph is showing us is the comparisons of each company's revenue between 1995 and 2000 and between 1995 and 2005. So let me explain this in more detail. Let's say Colgate made 100 in 1995 and we're shown that the percentage change in 2000 was minus 5%. That means that they made 95 in 2000. Now, let's say Sensodyne made 10 in 1995 and they had a 1% increase in 2000. That means that they made 10.1 in 2000. So with that in mind, you can see how describing Sensodyne as having a higher revenue than Colgate isn't accurate. And what we must describe in our answer is the percentage changes. So now that we have that math lesson out of the way, we can start analysing the question as normal. Once more, there's more than 1 year, so we're going to look for the increases and decreases. Here are all the increases and decreases for 2000, and then all the increases and decreases for 2005. To help me organise these, I'm going to put a star over Sensodyne and Aquafresh, because they're the only ones that increased in both years. I'll mark Colgate and Close-Up with circles as both of those decreased in the first year but increased in the second. The only other significant feature that I noticed on this chart is that Close-Up has the biggest increase on the entire chart, so I'll mark that with an X to help me remember that. So with step 1 finished, it's time to move on to steps 2, 3 and 4 where we actually write the answer. So here's the introduction. The graph illustrates the differences in the income of 5 toothpaste companies in 2000 and 2005 in comparison with their income in 1995. Overall, compared to 1995, Sensodyne and Aquafresh's revenues were higher in both years, while Crest's was lower in both years. For Colgate and Close-Up, their revenues were lower in 2000 but higher in 2005. Moving on to the first details paragraph. Sensodyne's income in 2000 was about 1% higher than in 1995, and this increased to roughly 5% in 2005. For Aquafresh, on the other hand, there was an increase of around 3% in 2000, but a slightly lower increase of approximately 1% in 2005. Meanwhile, the revenue in 2000 for Crest was about 7% lower than the revenue in 1995, and in 2005 there was a marginally smaller decrease of roughly 5%. And then onto our second details paragraph. The money made by Colgate in 2000 was around 5% lower, whereas in 2005 the figure was approximately 5% higher than in 1995. Close-Up made about 7% less in 2000, but roughly 12% more in 2005, giving it the most significant increase on 1995's earnings of any company in the years shown. And here's the full answer. You probably noticed that analysing this question was the most difficult part, and writing it was actually pretty straightforward after that. Hopefully you've learned a lot from this lesson so far, and if you have, make sure to give me some feedback by clicking like on the video. Now the next question has multiple charts where the data in each is unrelated, so we need to describe those separately. By this I mean that the table here shows the number of students and the pie charts show the sports that they like. So they are connected because they're about the same schools, but the actual data isn't related, so we can't make comparisons between them. Now, another important thing to pay attention to is that the data in this chart is from just 1 year, which means we need to organise the categories according to the highest and lowest for our overview. So I'll just add the letter H to all of the highest figures and the letter L to all of the lowest figures. You'll notice that the secondary school has 2 L's, and this is because swimming and rugby both have the lowest figure of 5%. In this question, the only other significant thing that I could see was that rugby has the lowest figure in both pie charts, so I'll mark this with a star, and we're ready to start writing the essay. Here's the paraphrase. The table illustrates how many students were in a Malaysian primary and secondary school during 2005, while the pie charts indicate the sports these students liked best. And the first part of my overview. Overall, the primary school had fewer students and the most popular sport was tennis, whereas football was the most liked in the secondary school. It might seem unusual that I mentioned the primary school having fewer students rather than mentioning the secondary school having more students, but I felt it was more logical to discuss the primary school first, and that's why I chose to write it in this way. And here's the rest of the overview. In both schools, rugby had the lowest figure, but this was joined by swimming in the secondary school. Okay, so let's jump straight into the details paragraphs. The primary school had 73,000 students and 40% of them stated that tennis was their favourite sport. The next most popular was football with 30%, followed by basketball and swimming at 15 and 10% respectively. Rugby was the sport that the fewest students liked best and had a percentage of 5%. And the final paragraph, in the secondary school there were 91,000 students and football had the highest figure of 40%. The second most popular sport was basketball at 35%, while tennis had less than half this figure with 15%. As in the primary school, rugby had the lowest percentage of 5%, but swimming also had the same number among these students. And here's the full finished answer. So that's 4 out of the 5 sample answers we've already looked at, and if you haven't already clicked subscribe on my channel or like on my page, go ahead and do that now. Now this next question is a little bit different because it actually has data from the future. And when that happens, we have to describe the data from the past separately from that data for the future. That means that even though this chart has 2 years, we must describe each year separately. And as we must do each one separately, that means that we're back to looking for highest and lowest figures for this question. So once more, I mark all of the highest figures with H's and all of the lowest figures with L's. And then we write the essay as normal by describing the data from the past first and from the future after that. The graphs illustrate how much money 5 industries made in Togo during 2000 and predictions for 2050. Overall, the total revenue is expected to be higher in 2050, and while the highest figure was shared by the soft beverages industry and information services in 2000, it's forecast that the most revenue will come from the semiconductor industry in 2050. You'll notice that I didn't mention anything about the lowest figures in my overview, and this is because there was already too much to say about the highest figures. So here's our next paragraph. In 2000, the 5 industries created $97 billion, with the soft beverages industry and information services both bringing in $25 billion. Meanwhile, real estate development was responsible for $20 billion of income and the semiconductor industry for $15 billion. Life insurance was the industry that had the lowest revenue figure of $12 billion. And the final paragraph, the projections show that Togo's revenue from these 5 industries is to be $196 billion in 2050, with the majority of this, $126 billion, coming from the semiconductor industry. Both the soft beverages industry and real estate development are shown to have an income of $25 billion, while information services and life insurance have the lowest figure of $10 billion each. And here is the full essay. Now before we finish up, I have a bonus tip for you. Students regularly ask me if they should start with task 1 or with task 2 when they're doing their IELTS writing test. So the best answer is that you should do whatever feels most comfortable for you, but I do have some things that you can consider. If you start with your best task, you're less likely to run over time, and that means that time management for the second task will be much easier. The other thing is, whichever task you decide to write first, don't look at the other task until you've finished. By that I mean, if you start with task 1, don't look at the task 2 question until you've finished your task 1 answer, because you don't want the task 2 answer going through the back of your head and distracting you from what you need to focus on. So with that, let me know in the comments if you're going to start with task 1 or with task 2 in your IELTS writing test.